A bricklayer swings a heavy hammer against a stone facade in 1696 London. Dust plumes rise as another window disappears into a wall of solid mortar. Parliamentary tax collectors march through the streets with ledgers in their hands. Thousands of homes across England are systematically plunged into permanent darkness. A family huddles in the shadows of a room designed to be lit by the sun. They chose to forfeit the light to save their meager savings from the state. This was the price of survival in a world where glass was a luxury for the rich. But the true cost of this darkness was far more lethal than a simple tax. The English window tax of 1696, officially the Act of Parliament 7 Will 3C 18, forced an architectural transformation across the nation. Homeowners measured their windows with terror, knowing every pane increased their annual tax burden. To avoid the levy, architects began designing houses with blind windows. These were brick-filled recesses that mimicked the appearance of glass from the exterior. They provided the facade of status while ensuring the interior remained a tomb of stagnant air. This policy remained in effect for over a century, stifling the health of the working class until 1851. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to see the thousands of years of struggle that preceded it. Humanity spent millennia fighting the freezing winds of northern Europe without the benefit of a transparent barrier. In the Neolithic settlement of Skara Brae, dated to roughly 3180 BCE, the inhabitants faced the brutal Orkney winters. They constructed their dwellings with thick, dry stone walls and buried them into the earth for insulation. The only opening in these stone structures was a small smoke hole located in the center of the roof. When the storms rolled in off the Atlantic, the inhabitants covered these holes with flat stone slabs. They secured them further with thick, cured animal hides to seal the interior from the biting cold. Light was a secondary concern when the primary goal was keeping the hearth fire from being extinguished by the gale. The Roman world approached the problem with more material ingenuity, yet the domestic reality remained bleak. Pliny the Elder documented the early development of cast glass in his work Naturalis Historia. However, this glass was opaque, costly, and reserved for the opulent public baths of Pompeii. The average Roman lived in a home where light and air were regulated by simple wooden shutters called valvae. Wealthier citizens in Herculaneum occasionally utilized thin, translucent sheets of mica or selenite, known as lapis specularis. These minerals were split into delicate layers and held in wooden frames to block the wind. They offered a flickering, distorted view of the world outside, but they remained a luxury of the elite. The Middle Ages brought little relief to the common home between 500 and 1400 CE. Glass windows were so scarce that the Doomsday Book of 1086 CE categorized them as removable chattels. Tenants routinely stripped the windows from their frames when they moved to a new dwelling. They treated glass as a piece of furniture rather than a permanent architectural feature. For the vast majority of the population, the window was a primitive barrier of oiled linen. Cloth soaked in linseed oil or animal fat provided a translucent film that diffused the light. It kept out the rain and the worst of the wind while barely illuminating the cramped interior. Parchment and vellum were also scraped thin and greased to serve as makeshift panes. The reliance on these sealed, lightless environments created a silent, indoor health crisis. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the central hearth served as the only source of heat for the entire household. With windows shuttered tight to retain warmth, the smoke from burning wood or peat had nowhere to escape. Paleopathology reports on skeletal remains from this era reveal the grim evidence of this trapped atmosphere. Chemical analysis shows high concentrations of carbon soot embedded within the lung tissue of the deceased. Chronic respiratory distress became a hallmark of urban and rural life during the long winter months. The very act of insulating a home against the cold effectively turned the dwelling into a gas chamber. Monastery inventories from the 14th century document the search for better alternatives to glass. Some institutions utilized thin-sliced horn, which offered a degree of transparency when polished and treated. It was a laborious process that turned a natural byproduct into a functional building material. Yet even this innovation was restricted to the wealthiest cathedrals and nobility. For the common person, the transition from stone slabs to leaded glass remained a distant dream. The struggle for visibility was a fight against cold, taxes, and the suffocating reality of the indoor hearth. It would take until the Excise Act of 1845 to finally strip away the barriers to glass production. Only then did the light finally reach the corners of the average home, ending a long, dark chapter of human architecture. The wind off the Atlantic Ocean battered the Orcadian coastline with unrelenting force. In the Neolithic settlement of Skara Brae, the inhabitants faced these brutal Orkney winters. Archaeological records date this site to roughly 3180 BCE. The villagers constructed their dwellings with thick, dry stone walls to withstand the gale. They did not build upward toward the sky. The people buried their homes deep into the earth for insulation. This technique, known as earth berming, shielded the stone interiors from the freezing exterior air. The architecture relied on mass rather than transparency. A single small opening sat in the center of the roof of each stone structure. This aperture served as the only source of ventilation for the hearth below. When the winter storms intensified, the inhabitants faced a dangerous choice. They had to seal the opening to prevent the fire from being extinguished. The builders utilized flat stone slabs as the original primitive shutters. They hoisted these heavy rocks over the smoke hole during the worst gales. The inhabitants secured the edges further with thick, cured animal hides. This act created a near-total seal against the biting cold. Inside, the living space became a tomb of stagnant, darkened air. Light was a secondary concern for the families of Skara Brae. Survival meant keeping the hearth fire burning throughout the long, dark season. The stone walls absorbed the heat of the fire and held it against the frost. But the design required a total sacrifice of visibility. For the duration of the storm, the interior plunged into total darkness. The reality was a life lived in a subterranean stone bunker. Every aspect of the home was designed to fight the freezing winds of northern Europe. The residents of Skara Brae occupied this site for centuries. They refined their stone building methods between 3180 and 2500 BCE, but the fundamental struggle for light remained constant. The stone slabs were not just construction materials. They were the primary tools of climate control in a pre-glass world. The environment dictated every movement within the stone dwelling. The inhabitants moved through the shadows of their homes by the glow of the hearth. They existed in a world without the possibility of a transparent barrier. This was the documented reality of human architecture in the Neolithic period. The cold was the primary architect of their domestic life. Every stone slab placed over a roof hole was a victory over the winter. Yet, it was also a surrender to the darkness. The Roman Empire brought a new material into the domestic sphere. Wealthy citizens sought a replacement for the dark, shuttered living spaces of the past. They turned to a mineral known as lapis specularis. Pliny the Elder documented this transition in his work, Naturalis Historia. He described the extraction of these thin, transparent sheets of mica and selenite. Miners cut the stone into large, flat plates. These plates allowed sunlight to penetrate deep into the Roman domus. Archaeologists discovered these mineral remnants in the ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The translucent sheets sat within ornate wooden or bronze frames. They provided a barrier against the Mediterranean wind. But to understand why this mattered, you need to see the divide between the elite and the common citizen. Public baths showcased the peak of this Roman innovation. Pliny the Elder recorded the use of cast glass in these high-status structures. The glass was thick, opaque, and incredibly expensive to produce. It bathed the communal halls in a soft, diffused glow. But the average Roman household remained cut off from such luxury. The standard domus relied on traditional wooden shutters called valvae. These shutters blocked the light entirely when closed for privacy or security. Heavy wool curtains, known as auleum, provided the only other thermal defense. Families spent their days in dim, flickering environments. The use of mica remained restricted to the highest echelons of society. It was a status symbol that signaled wealth and connection to the trade networks of the provinces. Even then, the material was fragile and prone to clouding. It did not offer the clarity of modern glass. It was a compromise between the necessity of warmth and the human desire for light. The reality was a city where the sun remained a luxury for the few. Most Romans lived in shadows, protected by wood and heavy cloth. The transition from stone slabs to mineral sheets was a small, fragile victory for architecture. It did not solve the problem of cold for the common citizen. The disparity between the bathhouse and the home defined the Roman experience. Visibility was tied to the weight of one's purse. The light of the sun was a commodity to be bought and maintained. In the centuries following the fall of Rome, the domestic landscape of northern Europe shifted toward a desperate ingenuity. Between 500 and 1400 CE, the common household lacked the transparency of mineral sheets. The residents relied on the organic materials readily available in their immediate environment. They turned to the skins of sheep and calves to create a barrier against the elements. Workers scraped these hides until they reached a translucent thinness. They treated the resulting vellum with animal fats or linseed oil to increase light penetration. These parchment windows filled the wooden frames of medieval homes. They blocked the biting wind while admitting a soft, diffused glow into the chamber. The light was never sharp or clear. It was an amber-hued illumination that shifted with the passage of the sun. Linseed oil played a critical role in this structural evolution. Families soaked scraps of linen in the oil to create a flexible, semi-transparent screen. These oil-soaked cloths served as a durable alternative to brittle parchment. They allowed the inhabitants to see the movement of the day without suffering the cold. Technological limitations dictated the size of every window. The frames remained small to prevent the collapse of the timber structure. Large openings would have compromised the structural integrity of the medieval home. Every window was a small, fragile compromise between the necessity of warmth and the hunger for light. History shows this was a world of diffused shadows. The transition from stone slabs to oiled skins marked a slow, incremental change in domestic comfort. Yet the limitation remained absolute. There was no clear view of the outside world through these greased membranes. The interior of the home stayed permanently veiled from the landscape beyond. This was the documented reality for the inhabitants of medieval Europe for nearly a millennium. The materials were ephemeral and prone to rot. They required constant maintenance to remain effective against the damp northern climate. Every window was a testament to the scarcity of clear, transparent alternatives. The residents lived within a self-contained, dimly lit ecosystem. The transition to glass remained a luxury reserved for the halls of power. Common homes continued to rely on the oil-soaked cloth and the scraped hide. This was the standard of living for the vast majority of the population. It defined the rhythm of domestic life until the rise of more accessible glass production. The year 1086 changed the legal status of light itself. King William I ordered a comprehensive survey of his English realm. The resulting Doomsday Book served as a ledger of all taxable assets. It catalogued land, livestock, and the physical structures of every village. The survey revealed a strange reality regarding the architecture of the era. Glass windows appeared in the records as temporary items. The law classified these windows as chattels rather than permanent fixtures. Tenants possessed the legal right to remove them when they vacated a home. A window was not an architectural necessity, but a valuable piece of property. The logic behind this classification was rooted in extreme scarcity. Glass production remained an arduous and expensive process in the 11th century. A single pane of glass represented a significant investment of labor. Homeowners feared leaving such wealth behind for a new tenant to claim. They dismantled their windows upon moving to avoid total financial loss. Empty frames remained in the walls as gaping holes to the outside world. This practice defined the security and the aesthetics of the medieval residence. The home was a shell that could be stripped of its most precious feature. Wealthy lords and commoners alike treated transparency as a liquid asset. The Doomsday Book confirmed that light was a commodity one carried away. This legal designation discouraged the permanent installation of glass. Architecture shifted to accommodate the frequent removal of these fragile sheets. Window frames were designed for ease of extraction rather than structural integration. The interior of the home became a site of constant transition. Walls were left exposed to the weather whenever a family changed their residence. The Doomsday records highlighted a society struggling to secure its own view. Visibility remained a luxury that required constant defense against theft. Glass was not yet a part of the house. It was a valuable tool that traveled with the owner. The survey documented a landscape of semi-finished dwellings. The lack of permanent glazing kept the medieval interior in a state of flux. Security and light were two separate concerns that rarely overlapped. The Doomsday Book preserved the evidence of this peculiar domestic compromise. It recorded a time when a window was something you took with you. The 13th century cottage floor held a central circular hearth. This stone pit served as the singular source of heat for the entire family. Wood and peat burned continuously throughout the long northern winters. These fires produced thick gray clouds of smoke that rose toward the rafters. The architectural design of the era lacked chimneys to vent these gases. The smoke filled the living space before slowly drifting out through small apertures. The homeowners sealed every wall and shutter to retain the precious warmth. They prioritized thermal insulation over the necessity of clean, breathable air. The interior atmosphere remained dense with particulate matter for months at a time. Paleopathology reports on skeletal remains from this era reveal the physical cost. Researchers examined the remains of individuals buried in 13th and 14th century cemeteries. The bones and teeth showed high concentrations of trapped carbon soot. Microscopic analysis of lung cavities confirmed chronic respiratory distress in these populations. The constant inhalation of wood smoke caused irreversible damage to the human body. The act of warming the home became a source of silent, cumulative mortality. Families lived in a haze of combustion byproducts from birth until death. The necessity of sealing windows for heat retention locked the toxins inside. This was a documented trade-off between freezing to death and slow poisoning. The 14th century hearth was a provider of life and a catalyst for illness. Archaeological evidence shows the soot penetrated the very walls of the structure. The environment within the cottage was physically toxic to its inhabitants. Historians categorize this as a period of severe indoor air quality crisis. The reliance on central hearths dictated the daily survival of every peasant household. The smoke remained trapped because the windowless walls offered no route for escape. The human skeleton remains the final record of this atmospheric struggle. It confirms that keeping the cold out meant bringing the smoke in. The 14th century cathedral archives hold a curious secret. Monastery inventories from this era list a material rarely seen in the common home. It was neither parchment nor linen, nor the impossibly expensive leaded glass. The records point to the horn of a cow. Artisans took the hard outer layer of the animal horn and subjected it to intense heat. They pressed the material until it turned into thin, translucent sheets. Inventory lists from 1300s monasteries detail the acquisition and repair of these horn panes. The cost was significantly lower than the imported glass used by the nobility. Still, the production required a level of specialized labor that few villages could provide. The horn was scraped until it reached a thickness of only a few millimeters. It was then set into wooden frames with lead or iron cames. The view through these windows was distorted and muted. It lacked the clarity of modern glazing, but surpassed the opacity of oiled cloth. The light that entered the monastery was warm, golden, and diffused. This was the height of architectural technology for the mid-14th century. The durability of horn made it a practical choice for large, exposed openings. It stood firm against the storms that shattered fragile parchment or rotting linen. The historical record confirms its widespread use in ecclesiastical settings before the 15th century. It represents a forgotten milestone in the long struggle for interior illumination. The horn window was a testament to the ingenuity of the medieval craftsmen. They turned waste from the slaughterhouse into a vital tool for human comfort. The archives prove that light was a resource that demanded constant innovation. Each sheet of horn was a victory over the freezing dark. It provided a temporary solution to a problem that would persist for generations. The transition from animal product to industrial glass was centuries in the making. The monastery inventories remain the primary record of this brief, amber-lit era. In 1696, the English Parliament passed the Act of Parliament known as 7 William III, Chapter 18. The government faced a severe currency crisis and a depleted national treasury. They sought a new source of revenue that could not be easily hidden from tax collectors. Lawmakers identified the window as the ultimate indicator of personal wealth. The logic was simple and brutal. A house with many windows required a large, expensive structure to contain them. Only the wealthy could afford to pay for the privilege of natural light. The architectural landscape of England began to change overnight. Grand facades lost their symmetry as owners sealed off rooms to save money. The interior of these homes fell into a state of permanent, unnatural darkness. The tax effectively penalized the health of the population. Sunlight was no longer a natural right, but a taxable luxury. The policy remained in effect for over 150 years. Records show that even the affluent retreated into shadows to protect their capital. Architecture during this period serves as a physical record of fiscal desperation. The bricked-up recesses remain visible on many historic buildings today. They stand as silent monuments to a tax that equated light with income. The government prioritized immediate liquidity over the basic needs of the citizenry. Ventilation suffered as fresh air was sealed away behind solid brick. The era of the blind window defined the domestic experience of the 18th century. It was a period where the state dictated how much light a family could possess. The tax was not repealed until the year 1851. Only then did the blind windows begin to open once again. The history of the window in England is a history of the state controlling the home. The 1696 Act proved that visibility was the first thing to be sacrificed for the sake of the Treasury. The year 1845 marked the beginning of a quiet revolution in British architecture. The British government finally acknowledged the stifling impact of the glass excise. Parliament moved to address the scarcity of natural light in domestic dwellings. Legislators introduced the Excise Act of 1845 to reform the manufacturing process. The law specifically targeted the heavy levies placed on glass production. Factories across the industrial heartlands had operated under crushing financial pressure for decades. Manufacturers struggled to innovate, while the state taxed the very material of progress. The 1845 Act provided the first clear path toward affordable, mass-produced glazing. But to understand why this shift mattered, you need to see the century of darkness it finally ended. For generations, the average citizen lived in homes designed to hide from the tax collector. The repeal of the glass duty reached its conclusion in 1851. The government officially removed the tax on glass production in that year. Construction sites across London immediately pivoted away from the bricked-up facade. Builders dismantled the masonry that had sealed the blind windows for over a century. Glass became a standard feature of common architecture rather than a luxury for the elite. The interior of the Victorian home underwent a total transformation. Sunlight flooded into rooms that had known only the flicker of candles or oil lamps. Fresh air circulated through spaces that had remained stagnant since the 1600s. They used stone slabs in Skara Brae and parchment in medieval monasteries. They endured the toxicity of indoor smoke to retain the warmth of the hearth. The 1851 repeal signaled the end of the long struggle for interior visibility. The window evolved from a taxable asset into a fundamental human necessity. The history of the home is a history of the struggle against the dark. Every pane of glass today is a silent witness to that long, cold journey. The journey began in the damp stone chambers of Skara Brae. Neolithic builders stacked slabs to seal their homes against the Orkney winds. They relied on nothing but animal hides to block the freezing air. Thousands of years passed before the Roman Empire introduced the first translucents. Pliny the Elder documented the use of mica and selenite in the villas of Herculaneum. These thin mineral sheets allowed light to filter through the dark. Yet for the average citizen, the shutter remained the only defense. The Doomsday Book of 1086 classified glass as a removable chattel. It was a luxury asset, not a structural necessity of the home. Medieval families stretched oiled parchment across frames to catch the dim light. Monastery inventories from the 14th century reveal the use of thin sliced horn. Each material was a desperate attempt to keep the hearth fire burning. The 13th century hearth trapped soot inside shuttered, windowless walls. Skeletal remains now show the physical cost of that trapped indoor smoke. Generations of families lived and died in rooms filled with toxic air. The 1696 window tax redefined the home as a taxable luxury. Legislation forced thousands to brick up their own windows to survive. The blind windows of London remain as physical monuments to that fiscal policy. Architects spent 150 years designing houses meant to stay in the dark. The repeal of the glass duty in 1851 finally shattered that era. Mass production turned the window into a standard feature of modern life. Humanity had fought the cold with stone, skin, and grease for millennia. Visibility was the final victory over a history defined by the hearth. You look at the glass in your own home today and see nothing but a view. You do not see the centuries of brick and soot that stood in your place. The cycle of the state watching your walls for profit never truly ended. It only changed its shape. You are still living in a house built by a history that wanted you to stay in the dark.